Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14 here. Today we are continuing our preview of SEC football teams for the 2022 season. We arrive at Ole Miss, which always has an interesting offseason with the Portal King, Lane Kiffin, who has had an interesting offseason in his own right. My good friend Trey Wallace of Outkick did a very interesting piece about some changes he's made in his life. It was a great read, so I would suggest looking that up. But the Rebels last year, Blake, won 10 games and frankly looked poised again to challenge for that second or third spot in the SEC West.
Yeah, looks like it, but they will look a lot different doing so.
Yeah.
Different roster, as we know, and it's one where, like you said, transfers coming in and seeing how everyone gets acclimated, and there's no doubt the talent's there. We've said it many times now throughout our videos. We've been watching all of them, which I hope you have. We talked about Ole Miss kind of as one of those teams in the West that it's just been hard to get a read on. Of course, as we're doing this, you still don't know who the starting quarterback is going to be. We still don't know exactly some of the things, like we said, with kind of plugging in the transfers and knowing that the roster is just going to look different. I mean, you've got to replace a lot of guys that were very productive last season, and I think anytime you have to do that, there's going to be some questions heading into the season. But nonetheless, talent will not be an issue. And again, you kind of look at what Lane Kiffin does in terms of his scheme and those kind of things, and you have confidence that they'll be able to figure it out. But still, experience, a lot of new faces. Those are probably, the questions in terms of we just haven't seen this team together yet. And I think it'll, once we start to see that in those first couple games, probably have a better feel of maybe what the potential will be for this team in particular. So,
Blake, we're doing this about a week and a half before the opener. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that Ole Miss does not have a quarterback? I mean, I think everybody presumed that Southern Cal Jackson Dart would probably be the guy. Our look publicly at Blake Altmaier was in the Sugar Bowl last year against a really good Baylor defense, and he didn't play well. Of course, he was not put in the greatest of spots. You don't play much all year, and your star quarterback goes down. And so I don't know if that was a fair look at what Altmaier can do, but it was about the only look we've had. So what do you make of where they are with quarterbacks right now?
I mean, I think we kind of always say it. Like, I think they have a very good idea of who's gonna be the quarterback. I would think at this point. But I just think it's one of those where I don't know. I mean, look, do you gain an advantage by waiting to this point? Is it so close that you're just, we're going to take it down to the wire? And if that's the case, then maybe that is more of an issue. If it's just a matter of necessity, and we have to name someone at some point. But I don't tend to think that's the case. Like I said, I think it's one of those things where you let these guys maybe just battle it out until the finish. And, then I'm trying to think of it like the best way to say it. Like, you let these guys battle it out. You don't name one early. And then if it, throughout the season, maybe there's not that, that second guy, the guy who doesn't get named the starter, he's in a position where it's like, hey, you can step right in, and maybe there's not the hurt feelings and those kind of things, which, let's be honest, like in this era, like the transfers and all that, like
Yeah.
everybody wants to play. And I think that's certainly something to think about. So I'm with Lane Kiffin on this. I mean, he said it. Many other coaches have said it. I mean, it's competition. I think is always going to be a good thing in terms of just having two guys that maybe you feel like are very close together, and just having that competition go down to the wire. I don't make a whole lot of it, to be honest. I think it's just a matter of look. Once they name a starter, then you go from there, and we see how that guy performs, knowing that according to how this has played out, the guy behind him was not that far off, right? So
Yeah.
if that first guy can't, get the job done, then you feel like at least, okay, maybe this guy behind him can do a few things, tweak a couple things, and maybe take that next step. So I don't have a lot of concerns, although again, it's not Matt Corral, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's,
But
that's maybe the bigger
few are. He was
right. Yeah.
so underrated.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm one that thinks he'll have a very nice pro career. I'm not saying he'll be an all pro every year or anything, but I think he's someone that, and two, like we said, it's the weapons around them too. Like, it's not just the guys who are going to get named the starters. It's look, you are losing some production from that team last year, and but I think there's just enough playmakers to help whoever it is. But it is interesting. It's an interesting question. I think that different people would probably answer it in a different way. So
Yeah, I think what you're trying to say is wait and make sure you get the right guy. And plus, we've talked about Ole Miss's schedule in a different video, and I'll look this up as I'm talking, but it's the first 4 games. If Ole Miss doesn't win all 4, I think we'd both be surprised. It's Troy, Central Arkansas, road trip to Georgia Tech, and Tulsa.
yeah.
So, and then that sets up for a home game against Kentucky, then a road trip to Vanderbilt. No team in the league has got an easier first half of the schedule than Ole Miss has got. So it's whoever your quarterback is, you've got a pretty good break-in period before it gets tough in the second half.
Yeah, and I think realistically, you can probably navigate those first 4 games, even if you're still not sure at that point,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, you can probably still find a way to win. And look, we always say I don't think anyone wants to rotate quarterbacks. I just don't think that's the situation you want to be in. Although we've seen it work to some people's success and those kind of things, but I think you'll be able to play around with some things those first 4 games. Because look, I mean, on paper, Georgia Tech's not a that's just not a great team, right? And so I think that's something to consider, even if it's a road game. But really, I think for Ole Miss, and we're not knocking any of the teams they're playing, but it's just you expect Ole Miss to be more talented, better, probably on both sides of the ball than some of these other teams. Yeah, it's that Kentucky game. Like I feel like that's the one where it really starts to kind of look at, I mean, even if we talked about kind of that Troy game though is kind of interesting, right? Because I know we're doing more of like a season overview, but we said, I mean, this is a Troy team that had
They can defend a bit.
I was going to say they were a top 25 team defensively last year, and that's where too you think about that. Like I think that game is interesting from that standpoint. Again, we're not knocking Troy because they have a lot of returning starters on defense, top 25 in the nation, I think in total defense last year, and so I mean, as an offense too. So I think actually, like we said, you are kind of looking at that schedule feeling like you're going to be in a position where your talent's going to kind of carry you through those first 4 games. But then, that is where things pick up with a game against a Kentucky team. But yeah, I mean, really, the more you look at it, that Troy game is interesting for your starting quarterback specifically because you're going up against a defense that was really good last year. And so, look, maybe that is kind of the gamesmanship, right? Knowing if you're Lane Kiffin,
Yeah.
Troy is not exactly a defensive team that it's going to come in without any sort of hope whatsoever. I mean, they can defend, and so maybe that's one of your elements too for waiting a bit. So,
Well, I like the pieces Ole Miss has on offense. It may not be names that SEC fans know unless they've studied the offseason and the portal, but you start up front with the offensive line. You've got 4 guys back who've started. That includes Nick Broker, who's regarded generally as one of the league's best. They've got a tight end in Michael Trigg, who's a Southern Cal transfer. Didn't do much a year ago statistically, but I think there's been some pretty wild expectations about what he can do and potentially being one of the best in the country. I say wild. I don't mean to dismiss the talent, but I mean, there's been some stuff thrown out there. I think a lot is expected of this kid right away. They've got Jonathan Mingo back at receiver. They've got Jordan Watkins transferring in from Louisville to help them at receiver. They'll spread the ball around like they did a year ago, I'm sure. They bring in talented targets, and Lane Kiffin is really good at utilizing a lot of guys to get it done. And then Ole Miss really has not had a premier running game in a while, but they've got one of the best, maybe 3 or 4 running backs in the league. And TCU transfer Zach Evans, who I think was a 5-star recruit. They got Ulysses Bentley the fourth from SMU backing him up. So Ole Miss kind of made the run game was a passing game, so to speak, short passing, and they haven't had a slog it forward type of tailback. And I don't know how they'll use them, but they've got some talent at running back too. Is the point that I'm making here, which is again something a lot of years they've not had.
I love the stat. I was looking a while back. Athlon had the stat. I wrote this down in my Ole Miss notes for the year. The losing, 2,582 rushing yards from last year when you combine Ely and all those guys together that left. I think it was their top 4 rushers in terms of yardage,
which would include
Corral. Yeah, but you bring in Evans, right? Who rushed for, I think it was like, I don't know, it was almost 1,100 yards in a couple years at TCU. And then Bentley like totaled, I think it was like 1,600 yards in 3 seasons at SMU. So combine that together, that kind of makes up for it. But again, that's kind of the interesting element here, like you said, where it's certainly having some sort of efficient running game will help out too. Because like we said, as of right now, we have questions at quarterback, and the biggest question is we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. Even though around them there's a lot of playmakers, a lot of starting talent back on the offensive line. Too, they bring in Charlie Weiss Jr. as the co-offensive coordinator, so you probably add in some new wrinkles there too on the offensive side. But yeah, I mean, talent's not going to be an issue. Even I think it's easy to look at Ole Miss and just say, "Man, they lost a lot," which they did. It's true. That's just reality. But the reality also is, I think they're bringing in a lot of talent, and you feel like at least we don't know what the chemistry is going to look like yet, but I at least think a lot of the talent they're bringing in will be able to make up for,
Yeah.
I don't want to say all of what they've lost, but a lot of that just in terms of kind of looking at what they'll lean on with some of the playmakers they'll have on offense. And then again, it just all kind of goes back to the quarterback position and seeing how that plays out. So,
Well, Ole Miss got a lot better defensively last year. I think they shaved, I don't know, 12, 14 points off on scoring defense. Of course, they lost Sam Williams, who's was one of the better defenders, if not players, in the league a year ago. They run a 3-2-6. They've got some guys back on the front seven. The defensive line, they've got Cedric Johnson and J.D. Hill, or excuse me, K.D. Hill. And then they loaded up at linebacker, which they did last year when they got Chance Campbell from Maryland. They got Troy Brown, who was, I think, a 3-time All-MAC guy at Central Michigan. They got a couple of guys in J.J. Pegues from Auburn, Jared Ivey at Georgia Tech. In the secondary, they return a bunch of guys too. A.J. Finley, Tysheem Johnson, Otis Reese. Those guys played a lot of snaps. And so in a league where you get a lot of turnover, there's some names back from a defense I think that was better than maybe it got credit for being, although Sam Williams kind of was in my mind, the guy who made them go. And I think Chance Campbell was their leading tackler. So there's still some questions there.
yeah, I think you talked about like Williams, right, and the sacks and that what that can do for your defense. And really that secondary, there's a lot of guys in there. I mean, there's a lot of guys they have returning, and so I don't think depth's an issue, but it's just I feel like Ole Miss is one of those teams that will certainly be able to, if they can just force those takeaways, if they can make the game a little bit easier, can this defense do that? Again, having to replace a guy that had as many sacks as Williams did, but you've got so many transfers coming in, and you feel like I think the best word is like they're going to continue to progress on defense. I don't know that they'll be an elite defense necessarily, but I think they're going to continue to get better in that area, and that's where again having some of the guys back that will that have been here now and kind of understand what you need to do. But I think some of the guys coming in, you mentioned some of the names. I mean, I just think some of the guys coming in will be able to kind of plug in some of those spots. And I don't think I would be pessimistic about what this defense could do because they did take a big step forward last year, just in terms of kind of changing some of the things they did on that side of the ball. But probably more of a wait and see approach with some of these guys, although, they do have some guys. You mentioned like Brown coming in. I mean, he's an all MAC guy. And so can that translate to, being able to make the kind of same impact that you can, in the SEC and those kind of things. And so I'm curious to see how it plays out. But I think they have enough depth on that side of the ball. I do think there's a chance for them to be better, especially with some of the guys they're going to bring in.
Here's one other thing to think about. We don't talk a lot about special teams, but I think you and I both believe that a lot of those games in the West this year are just going to be toss-ups. Really a lot of games in the SEC period. And that's where a field goal can make or break you. They lose their kicker, Caden Costa. He's got a year suspension for performance-enhancing drugs. They get Jonathan Cruz from Charlotte, who had a pretty decent career there. So that's something to watch. I don't know what all that means. I don't know that it's that big of a talent swap either way, but that's sort of an off-season note that I don't know that a lot of people picked up on.
Yeah, something to think about too. We always say, and we talked about it with some other teams specifically, the importance that can play. And there's no doubt that it will be very important in terms of, again, when we expect it just to have a lot of close games. What we say with the West, there's not a lot separating a good group of those teams in the West, and so that will obviously come into play in some of those games, just given how close you expect them to be. And the point spreads right now, if you had them on all the games, a lot of those SEC West games would be, I think, very close in terms of field goal or less, maybe even on some of those. So.
Well, we have either previewed your team or we will be previewing your team. The best way to find that is to subscribe to our YouTube channel here at Southeastern 14. We appreciate those of you who've done that. If you've not, please punch that button, help us out, and help yourself out. And we'll be back soon with our next SEC football preview.